Hello and welcome to this recorded version of the talk that I gave for Art and Christianity. This is a talk entitled Norwich Cathedral, New Perspectives in Medieval Sculpture. My name is Rob Hawkins. I did a PhD focusing on the Norwich Cloister bosses at the University of Cambridge, supervised by Paul Binsky. And I'm now an ordinand training for ordination at Westcott House in Cambridge. Unfortunately, we had a technical problem on the night, so I'm going to give the first half of the talk now, and then it will blend seamlessly with the talk as it was given last week. So, the elaborately sculpted vault bosses of Norwich Cathedral Cloister are one of the real glories of late medieval English sculpture. They were carved in a number of campaigns of vaulting work between about 1300 and 1430, while the cloister was being gradually rebuilt. Now, I'm most interested in the bosses from the final campaigns, carved between about 1410 and 1430, which are particularly virtuosic in their distortion of pictorial space. Straight lines are rendered as curves, cuboids are radically warped, and figures twist through crazy angles, each boss forming a kind of bulbous hemisphere of intricate narrative. Now, I've long been interested in questions around pictorial space in sculptural relief. The idea that visual space and its representation, which can seem so kind of matter of fact to us, is culturally specific and it has a history. So when I saw a photograph of one of these bosses with its strange kind of fish-eye convexity, its bulging sphericity, well, I knew that I hadn't ever seen anything like it, and I wondered, therefore, if these objects might be suitable for some sustained thinking about these problems. And so they became the starting point for my PhD research. This evening, I want to share with you some of the questions that I've been asking about these bosses and point towards where we might find some answers. I'm going to very briefly set the scene for you in terms of the cloister's construction, and I'll then explain how photogrammetry helped me to capture the bosses in all of their curvature in a way that conventional photography would struggle to do. Finally, I want to point to some of the big art historical questions that these bosses pose about style, about sculptural space, and about point of view. And I'll try and keep this talk to about 50 minutes so that there's time for questions. Now, the Gothic cloister of the Benedictine Priory at Norwich replaced an earlier Romanesque cloister, which was damaged in the fire of 1272. When work started on the new cloister, it started with these 3 bays in front of the chapter house, and it quickly moved on to incorporate the rest of the east walk. Now, the vaulting pattern is consistent throughout the cloister, but even within the first campaign on the east walk, we find a number of different sorts of bosses. In the first few bays to be vaulted, there are only these simple foliate bosses, kind of lumps of vegetation at each junction. But then towards the southern end of the east walk, we see the introduction of much more characterful bosses, grotesque figures, and green men. And the bays at the northern end were next to be vaulted, this time with scenes of Christ's Passion on the central bosses and jongleric, playful bosses at the subsidiaries. And all of that work on the east walk that I've been describing, with those various different sorts of sculpture, was probably complete by 1313. Then, after the east walk, the south walk was begun straight away. When the time came for the vault, probably in about 1325, the decision was taken to begin a monumental apocalypse cycle running down the central bosses. And this continues throughout the south and the west walks, and it's what the cloister is best known for. Now, we know from documentary sources that the first 10 bays of that south walk were complete by 1330, but there was then a huge hiatus in the vaulting work. Some work did carry on throughout the 14th century, but this was only on the garthside wall and its tracery, and not on the vaulting itself. So it actually wasn't until 1411 that vaulting work began again, but it picked up exactly where it had left off nearly a century before, at the southwest corner. And 10 years were then spent vaulting these 5 bays here in the corner. These bays continue the trend already established in that south walk of having apocalypse scenes at the central junctions and grotesques and animals at the subsidiaries. Stylistically, these corner bosses are a real mix. There are some very fine bosses, but also some cruder ones. And it's here that things start to get spatially really funky, doing the kinds of things that I was interested in with point of view. This Windmill Boss is the first in the cloister to really exploit this new kind of mannered spatial distortion. And I'll come back to talk about it shortly. After those corner bays, they then vaulted the North Walk between 1423 and 1426. The North Walk completes the Passion and Resurrection series begun a century earlier in the northeast corner, but it then embarks on a medley of scenes of saints' lives, martyrdoms, miracles of the Virgin. And it's here in the North Walk that things get stylistically really virtuosic. The boss designs become more complex and more daring in their covaciousness and distortion. We see, for example, this boss of the Supper at Emmaus, or this boss of Herod's Feast, or this one of Christ appearing at the table in the upper room. And that bold distortion developed in the North Walk carried on in the West Walk, completed just afterwards in 1425 to 1430. Here, all the bosses, main and subsidiary junctions, are given over to completing that monumental apocalypse cycle. These bosses are very complex, very delicate, with many crowds of minutely individuated figures and curved architectural structures. So just to sum up, the east and the south walks are of the early 14th century. The southwest corner is vaulted in the early 15th century, and the north and the west walks are then vaulted in the 1420s, and all the vaulting was complete by 1430. So we've got our heads around the construction sequence, and we can begin to zoom in on the particularly funky later bosses in the north and the west walks. Now, when I came to look at what art historians have said previously about these bosses, I found that it's an odd situation. A number of scholars have studied the cloister in detail, and yet no one has considered the sculptural style, which seemed to me to be so distinctive, in all that much detail at all. Early iconographical studies by M.R. James and E.W. Tristram identified the scenes represented in almost all of the bosses. They didn't consider the chronology of the building campaigns in much detail, but that task was taken up by Eric Fernie and Arthur Whittingham in the 1970s, who examined the records of expenditure for the priory and were able to deduce from those a reliable sequence of construction. And it's in the last 20 years that discussion has moved beyond the basic kind of who, what, when questions to get more at the question of why. Veronica Sekulies and Paul Binsky each offer accounts of different local and national factors that might have influenced the choice to commission such an extravagant program of sculpture. But there has been almost no discussion of the remarkable spatial idiom developed in those later bosses. Sekulies noted that each scene is ingeniously adapted to fit the cramped round space of each boss. But I wanted to be able to say more than this. I think she's absolutely right. I just thought there was more to say. The only other comment I found about the style of the bosses was derisive, made by Edward Pryor and Arthur Gardner in their landmark survey of English medieval sculpture. According to them, these later bosses in the North Walk are weaker than their East Walk antecedents. Gardner says that they have more crowded compositions and that storytelling in a small compass seemed to be the boss carver's ambition. But for Gardner, that ambition was kind of damnable hubris. He singled out the scene of Herod's feast as being ineffective, shallow, and confused in composition, very inferior to the earlier carvings. Now, these comments, I think, are telling because they expose something of an underlying narrative of late medieval decline, which is part of why these bosses, I think, haven't been much discussed. That narrative of decline, which was Ruskin's before it was Gardner's, it sees the 14th century as a period of kind of slippage into decadence and naivety. If you like, the waning of the Middle Ages, a collapse into conventionalized idiom and licentiousness. According to Gardner, 14th century masons began to be seduced by ornament, curving and spreading things over the facts of construction. He says, with prodigality, the 14th century sculptor discarded the hard-won virtues of simplicity and reserve, and instead replaced them with contortion and the exaggeration of gesture, products of a disordered imagination, redundant and luxurious. And if the 14th century is a period of decline, then the 15th was for them really rock bottom. Gardner says, sculpture of the 15th century need not detain us long. It follows the traditions of the 14th, but with a tendency to deteriorate. So it in fact seems that it's exactly the boss's complexity, curvature, and contortion which ensured that 20th century scholars didn't consider them much worthy of study, and especially not in terms of questions about style. It's interesting that these are exactly now the same qualities which make them interesting for us. Perhaps something to say there about the postmodern taste for fragmentation, contortion, complexity. Alongside that historic dislike of late medieval licentiousness, I think there's also a basic methodological issue which might help to explain why these bosses haven't been much discussed until now. These sculptures are fixed about 15 feet above the ground. So when they're written about, they're reproduced photographically. And this is usually with one single photograph per boss, taken directly from below. This has the effect of flattening their swelling curvature. Yet much of what makes them remarkable is the way that they anticipate oblique angles of viewing. These bosses are sculpted in such a way as to require the viewer to move around them, slowly piecing together the different elements of the narrative. All this is lost if they are reproduced as single photographs, as they have sometimes been in previous publication. And this, I think, relates to a general issue which has some momentum in current scholarship. Geraldine Johnson has written about the relationship between sculpture and its photographic reproduction for publication. And she's shown that since Heinrich Wülflin's 1915 essay, How to Photograph Sculpture, scholars have at least been aware that the photographs chosen to represent sculpture in publication do have a great effect on the reader's impression of the work. But for Wülflin and his contemporary Adolf von Hildebrand and people of that time, this often tended to mean that good sculpture ought to have one dominant angle from which it can be viewed in order to prevent the viewer from having to be driven all around. This now seems like twisted logic. Rather than acknowledge the inadequacy of the photograph, Hildebrand instead wanted to judge sculpture qualitatively using the photographic paradigm of a static observer. More recent art history has admittedly been a bit more sensitive. Michael Baxendale and Svetlana Alpers, in their landmark book Tiepolo and the Pictorial Intelligence, pioneered the use of sequences of photographic views to try and convey the effect of shifting viewpoints. This tactic has gone on to be used to great effect by Jules Lubbock, who stressed the importance of oblique viewpoints in the study of Pisano's reliefs, and more recently by Jackie Young, looking at Sluter's Well of Moses. I think these montages are a good start, but there's still a risk, I think, because we can still end up talking about sculpture as a succession of fixed viewpoints. 6 photos might be better than 1, but we're still a long way from the experience of seeing these things in the flesh, where we can move around and around, edging backwards and forwards to understand the complex form of the object that we're looking at. And it was for that reason that I ended up experimenting with photogrammetry as a way of recording and presenting the bosses. It proved particularly useful to me when I began to try and find other sculptures across Norfolk and elsewhere produced by the same workshop. Huge variations in lighting, in weathering, in levels of repainting, it often makes it very difficult to compare sculptural forms across geographically distant sites. But photogrammetric modeling really helps with this. You can set sculptures alongside each other, which in reality are many miles apart, and you can retain the ability to change viewing angle, even to remove potentially misleading repainting and see just the basic form stripped of all colour. And they're easily hosted online as well, so it becomes possible to share such models as part of an ongoing academic discussion. And most importantly, the viewer can continue to manipulate the model any which way they like, so they retain something of the agency that they would have when roving around the sculpture in the flesh, slowly decoding each scene. Now, I'm going to try and share a few models with you, which means that I'll just stop sharing my slides and take you to a web browser. So this is Sketchfab. It's sort of like YouTube for photogrammetric models. And I'd like to share with you a few of the models that I was using as part of my study. This is the Windmill Boss that I've already shown you a slide of. Now, we're not sure what the scene represents. In our live talk last week, we had some ingenious suggestions of where in the Bible we might find an appropriate verse as source material for this boss. It's one of the few bosses in the cloister that's still unidentified, and the tricky thing about it is that it kind of comes out of nowhere. There's no scene either side that might indicate that we're dealing with a biblical reference here. It stands alone, so it's a bit of a puzzle. But the form of the boss is absolutely fascinating. It's one of the first to do this kind of strange, spatially distortive thing, and the different elements of the scene are kind of mutually occluding. You can't stand in one place and see the whole scene. So here we see a horse rider carrying a sack of grain to the mill for milling. And as we turn around the boss in the cloister and walk underneath it, we see the windmill with its beautifully kind of curved windmill blades stretching around the surface of the boss. And this wonderfully undercut detail of this ladder, which is really virtuosic piece of stone carving. And we see the miller in the doorway. Then further round here, tucked between the two ribs, we see what I think is a sack of flour being carried away into some kind of storehouse. So we've got these 3 elements on this fantastically curved surface. I'll show you a few more bosses just so you can see what I mean. This is that very fine boss of the supper at Emmaus. And again, we've got different elements of the narrative scene distributed around the different sides of the boss. So here we've got the disciples meeting Jesus unrecognized on the road away from Jerusalem, and we can see Jesus with kind of a pilgrim's bag, suggesting that they think of him as just another traveler on the road. And then further round, we can see them breaking bread together at the table, Jesus with the 2 halves of the loaf there. And then further up on the boss, we can see the hem of Jesus's robe as he disappears, as if whipped up into the heavens, disappearing, having been recognized. And then again, in these little interstitial spaces between the ribs, we see a choir of angels just kind of indicating heavenly space in this upper fringe. And it's beautifully curved with the way that these straight lines of the architecture are kind of subtly fish-eyed around the boss. I'll show you my favorite boss, I think, of Herod's Feast, the Feast of Herod and Herodias. This tends to go on posters and the cover of my thesis. I think it's one of the most special and exciting, because of the sheer complexity of the narrative and the way that it drives you around the boss in order to make sense of it. Here we see Herod and Herodias hosting this feast, egged on by these sort of demons in the form of monkeys, I think, perhaps symbolizing the kind of base nature of them as representations of worldly power. We see the guests of Herod's guests at the feast, which the gospel tells us are kind of important motivating factors, that Herod's got one eye on what his guests will think, so he has to kind of keep his promise to Salome. We've got Salome herself dancing before Herod. We've got John the Baptist and his executioner down in the corner here, John being martyred. And then we've got the head of John the Baptist being presented back to Herod and Herodias, where we meet them again at their banquet table. So it's an incredibly complex little scene, full of invention and spatial wit, and a really subtle piece of carving. Here are a few more with some simpler narratives, but kind of perhaps more outrageous spatial distortion going on, even more unusual pieces of carving. This is the martyrdom of Thomas Becket, or rather this is his entombment subsequent to his martyrdom. His martyrdom is also represented in the cloister. And here we see St. Thomas lying in his coffin in state, visited by what I presume are monks and a bishop, perhaps, blessing him. And it's the coffin that draws our eye to this once we're thinking about these questions of distortion and perspectival questions, because it is radically splayed around the surface of the boss. You don't notice it until you really spend time looking at it, because from the kind of usual angle of inspection, Thomas appears kind of pretty ordinarily arrayed in his coffin here. But as we look at the boss more closely, we realize just what has gone on in order to make that coffin kind of conform to the hemispherical shape of the basic boss. A similar layout of scene to that is the boss of the Assumption of St. John. And this has a nice little narrative surprise. It's an extra biblical story that when John the evangelist was, when he died, he was assumed into heaven bodily, and that manna was left found in his coffin as a surprise to onlookers. So as we approach the boss down the cloister, we see the first part of the story, John being hoisted up into heaven by these two very characterful angels. And it's only as we come underneath the boss and kind of look back up at it that we find the coffin revealed full of manna, as is mentioned in the narrative. So it's a surprise to us, just as it's a surprise to those witnessing it. And again, a very characterful piece of carving with lots of exciting undercutting. I'll show you one last boss, which is not in the cloister, but it is at a parish church not very far from Norwich. And it is a good example of how this style began to be taken up at other sites around Norfolk, as I'll explain in the second half of our talk. So this is a boss of the Resurrection from Little Parish Church at Denton, St. Mary's Church, Denton. And this is in the parish church porch. We can see elements that we now, I hope, recognize from the cloister of this kind of curvaceous, fisheye-like perspective, with the exciting stretching of narrative elements all the way around the form of the boss. So we can see Christ, 1 foot still in the tomb, 1 foot stepping out confidently, his body kind of beveled back across the surface of this boss, and we can see all around him the surprised soldiers falling back in awe, soldiers to either side of him, and a soldier tucked down here under his foot. So I think we'll leave it there for now. I don't want everybody to get dizzy. And this is where we'll rejoin the recording of the talk as it was given live last week. And then we come back and complete the circle, and there's John's head being presented on a plate to Herod. So it's incredibly fine work in a small compass. Here's some more outrageous distortion. This is a bust aerial of St. Thomas. And you can see that the way that this kind of coffin is stretched and curved in order to conform to this kind of hemisphere of the boss. From ground level, there's a kind of process of discovery as you see the monks engaged in the ceremony, and then as you continue to walk under, you see St. Thomas lying in state, and then you kind of, there's just a nice progression of the form as you kind of roll underneath it. Another on that theme is the Assumption of St. John, a nice little extra biblical myth that when St. John dies and is assumed bodily into heaven, there is manna found in his coffin in place of his body. And again, we discover this as we walk through the cloister. So you see John being kind of hoisted into heaven by this pair of angels here. And then as you walk underneath, along with the narrative, you discover this kind of coffin full of manna that is represented with this kind of gold bobbly stuff. So I think you can probably see, I hope you can see that these models start to make us alive to this kind of whole palette of strange distortions that this sculptural style employs. And part of my research was to then trace this style around different sites in East Anglia where it starts to be employed, perhaps by this same workshop. So I was find, and also to then model and add to my collection, a boss of the Resurrection in a little parish church in Denton. And you can see that similar sort of style of outrageous curvature and really characterful distortion. And we've got Christ here kind of boldly stepping out of the tomb, and the surprised soldiers falling away either side, and even soldier tucked around here. So that's probably enough bosses for now. I don't want everybody to get dizzy. I will stop sharing and take you back to the slides. Okay. So photogrammetric modeling then is a really valuable tool to have in the toolbox as a historian of sculpture. It helps us to remember that sculptural objects are three-dimensional and that they need to be moved around in order to be appreciated. And it helps us to get our eye in to see that this is a really peculiar and distinctive pictorial mode in which straight lines and cuboids are radically splayed and warped, and sub-narratives encourage us to follow stories on circular routes. And when we look in this way, I think we find that the bosses are not at all naive productions. Contra Gardner, it doesn't make sense to read them as part of a decline into convention, given that they're so witty and inventive and complex. I mean, sure, if we measure them against arbitrary standards of clarity and order, then they don't come off particularly well. They're complicated objects. But if we try and meet them on their own terms, then they're extremely impressive. So this is kind of where I got to in the second year of my research. I knew that these objects were really important, and I knew I wanted them to be sort of the keystone at the center of my thesis. But to buttress that keystone, I wanted some kind of context that would either help to explain or to interpret this unique sculptural idiom. How do we make sense of this kind of funky style such that we can say something more about it than simply noticing its funkiness? These are technical terms, by the way, in art history. So my first thought was to look for comparable examples locally. And to begin with, I was on well-trodden ground because Norwich Cathedral is, of course, famous for its boss sculpture. Following the completion of the cloister works in 1430, the nave, the presbytery, and the Bauchan chapel were all revaulted in the later 15th century between about 1460 and 1490. The nave and the Bauchan chapel particularly featured extensive boss schemes. Both are clearly in the tradition of complex narrative bosses that began in the cloister. But they're mostly rather different, I think, from the cloister examples. The nave bosses particularly are bolder and cruder, designed to be seen from much further away. Therefore, they're less exploitative of the viewer's movement. It's kind of a simple fact that the further away you are from an object, the more steps you physically have to take in order to achieve the same shift in the angle of your perception. Now, a few bosses do really funky things with space. Here's the Last Supper, for example. And in the Bauchan chapel, there are some nice distortions of architecture to create spheres, but it's still a little simpler and bulkier than the cloister bosses. And in any case, almost 50 years after the cloister work, it's pretty much impossible that these are by the same craftsman exactly. But going off the beaten track, I did find another group of sculptures which I think relate more closely to those in the cloister. There was a fashion in 15th century Norfolk for adding vaulted porches to existing churches. And this was the subject of Helen Lunnon's 2012 PhD at UEA. And a number of those porches host bosses, and I've identified a group, some of which we've already seen, which are stylistically comparable to the cloister work. And the bosses at Windham, at Heatherset, and at Denton are clearly related to each other, and they're all under 20 miles from Norwich. Each porch has a tiercerent star vault, which hosts 5 bosses. Here they all are. There's Windham, Heatherset, and Denton. And in each of these porches, the arrangement of the same 5 scenes, the 5 joys of the Virgin as they're known. So in each porch, we see an Annunciation, a Nativity, a Resurrection, and an Ascension, all grouped around the coronation of the Virgin. And in each case, the scene is kind of wrapped around the boss hemisphere in cut relief of varying depth. Here are all the Ascensions, including Norwich Cloister. You can see Christ's robe kind of disappearing into these cloudy frills in each case. Here are the nativities, including some fun little upside down animals, if you follow the scene all the way around. And the resurrections, of which you've already seen one as a model. So there's some variation, but lots of repetition. All these vaults are kind of low, so they invite this intricate, inventive work. You can inspect them closely as you pass underneath into the church. And all 3 are completed between 1420 and around 1450. We don't have exact dates, but plausibly in the immediate aftermath of the cloister work. So I was able to suggest that these porches are evidence of our distortive sculptural idiom being taken up at kind of satellite building sites in the orbit of the cathedral cloister works. This encourages us to see the cloister as a kind of laboratory of invention and experiment, from which ideas are pinched and then replicated elsewhere on smaller scales, consolidated and kind of rehearsed in replicable formulae. And I was really interested to find those 5 joys sequences, those 5 joys bosses being then kind of taken up again in Norwich itself and used as the scheme for the Chantry Chapel vault at the Great Hospital of St. Giles within the cloister close. And the Chantry was added sometime between about 1450 and 1480. There's a bit of dispute about the date. So those same formulaic 5 joys bosses appear, but here they're rendered in greater detail, really high quality sculpture with even more flamboyant spatial distortion. Here's the Resurrection, like the one that we saw at Denton. And here is the Ascension, much like those at Wyndham and Denton, now even more deeply undercut, really kind of virtuosic stone carving to get these heads so kind of free of the main block in brittle stone. It's hard to do, and this kind of very distinctive, almost fan vaulting pattern going on in the clouds. So what we have then is a thriving local culture of spatial inventiveness. These other local examples, therefore, became the kind of the stones immediately around my keystone, if you like, of the cloister. But beyond this, if we want to zoom out even further and establish a broader context, things get a little harder. Not many English bosses are as intricate or as playful as these. So we might perhaps look to contextual factors in Norwich to explain this particular flourishing of invention. It's perhaps significant that we start to find figural sculptors working as freelancers for the first time, really, in Norfolk and elsewhere in the early 15th century. These were specialist carvers. They appear in the accounts as gravers, like engraver in our modern English, brought in to do specialist work, presumably hired on the strength of party pieces such as these. And in fact, we do have the names of the gravers who cut the late bosses at Norwich. There's no record of them working anywhere else, unfortunately, but it's nice to have names. They were very well paid, with lodging and robes lined with fur and other perks recorded in the accounts. And they earned the equivalent, or even sometimes slightly more than the daily wage for a master mason of this period. It's a very sizable income. There's an interesting incident relating to a similar category of mason and his pay in Oxford in the 1390s, so just prior to the period we're thinking about. There's a mason called John Sampson who was taken to court for charging more than the kind of agreed rates. In that period, there was some legal regulation of how much you could pay a mason, and he was charging more, taken to court and acquitted on the grounds that his carving was agreed to be by the court of such capability and subtlety that it just couldn't be compared to the work of lower masons in terms of the depth of his knowledge and the judgment of his art. So we can perhaps see then that around the turn of the 15th century, flamboyant sculptural work could have been a calling card for superstar gravers like the knowledgeable and skillful John Sampson. And this kind of context is certainly important. It tells us about the economic circumstances that were necessary for such a style to emerge. We should also, I think, see these bosses as part of a broader, particularly English tradition, actually, across different media of using sculptural space in kooky and inventive ways in the 15th century. I ended up looking at misericords, for example, such as these cut in 1419 for St. Nicholas's King's Lynn, now in the Victoria and Albert Museum, which do similarly funky things. And there are models of them that I've put online that you could follow up. Here are other misericords in the same kind of distortive tradition, warping space around the country. Further afield, I found that the most comparable sculpture from the same period in terms of spatial playfulness was to be found in the Brabant region in the Netherlands. And I was amazed to come across this drawing made in the 1440s by Roger van der Weyden's workshop in Brussels. And this is a preparatory drawing for this sculpted capital on Brussels Town Hall. It's called the scoopsto drawing, which kind of means chair throwers. I think there's some sort of proverb behind it, but I can't immediately bring it to mind. It's a very rare instance of a preparatory drawing and the sculpture for which it is preparatory, both surviving. And together they raise fascinating questions for the Norwich bosses. I've often wondered whether the Norwich bosses were drawn out in 2 dimensions and then somehow rolled or projected across the hemispherical surface. This fascinating drawing, which if rolled up, forms a kind of truncated cone, a similar shape to the finished capital, provides tantalizing clues as to one way that might have been done. And this Brabantine link is made even more interesting by the fact that carvers from the Netherlands were often working in East Anglia in this period. One of the Norwich Cloister carvers, for example, is down in the accounts as Bryce Ducheman, probably Dutchman. So these contexts, local and international, help us to set Norwich craftsmanship within a much broader landscape. We can even try to recover period terms for these sculptural effects. For example, I came across one contract which gives us 2 terms that might be useful. This pertains to the vaulting of St. George's Chapel, Windsor. So it's 75 years late, but this lateness, I think, is mitigated by the fact that it does describe specifically sculpted bosses. And it specifies that in this case, they want the bosses in the choir to be more pendant and hollower than those in the nave. And these terms are really interesting. Hollower can mean either hollow in our modern sense, but also quite fluidly concave and convex interchangeably. Also sometimes full of holes. One 16th century definition says full of holes like a pumice. So there's this idea of a surface that's kind of deeply drilled. And pendant, meaning sort of hanging down, protruding or dangling. So put together, hollower and pendant, these terms work to describe a sculptural style, which is kind of a mixture of protrusion outwards and recession inwards. And the person commissioning, therefore, wants bosses which are both swelling downwards and deeply inwardly cut, which is costly and difficult to do as a mason. And this is what they got. The choir bosses at St. George's are indeed a step change from the flatter bosses in the nave. But there remains this question of point of view. I was not really any closer to saying much about this kooky spherical style, and being able to notice other examples elsewhere wasn't really helping. It was kind of adding color to the picture, but I still wanted to be able to talk about what was going on spatially in period sensitive terms. Now, if we try and think in a more focused way about sculptural space, we begin to notice that we're really dealing in these bosses and in those curvaceous misericords with a whole raft of different floutings of pictorial and sculptural norms, actually developed later in the Renaissance. I've repeatedly called these bosses distorted, but what exactly are they distortions of? Reality, of course, but every representational system distorts reality wildly. I think if they are distortions, then they're distortions of the dogmas of perspectival representation, which they in any case predate. And it's a neat coincidence that our boss of Herod's Feast was cut around 1426, the same year that Donatello cast his version of the same subject in Italy. And I think these are polar opposites really in their use of relief. They imply different sorts of viewers. Donatello's converging orthogonals assume a static observer, whereas the kind of the splayed cuboids and the curved hemisphere of our boss assumes and demands that the viewer moves, offering new information from each angle. The pictorial structure in Donatello's relief implies a world which extends infinitely and consistently in every direction. We look into this world through a window, and surfaces and figures are cut in half by the edge of that window. We see only a slice of things, as if that were a slice of what is objectively there. But the boss, on the other hand, tries to show us a whole world, self-sufficient and producing its own curved limit. It's a world in which space and its axes are more malleable. Both pieces of relief work make assumptions about the subjective and the objective, the difference between how things appear and how they are. Donatello is so concerned to show a world which is measurably and consistently correct that he kind of has to nail the spectator to a fixed point, like a butterfly pinned to a board. But the boss sculptor, on the other hand, seems to accept that we only ever see things partially, nothing is ever quite as it appears, and that things will also look different depending on where we look at them from. And so the sculptor might as well have fun with that. If you like, the butterfly is allowed to roam free. This structural difference only becomes apparent when we stop treating these bosses as flat plates and start seeing them in the round as sculptural objects. We're used to thinking of Renaissance perspective as in some sense correct and making it analogous to other epistemological strategies like the scientific method, where things can be precisely known and measured by limiting the conditions of the investigation, just like the spectator is limited to a fixed ideal viewpoint. And in this narrative, medieval spatial representation tends to come off badly as a naive, inconsistent, and intuitive style, correlated with a naive view of an inconsistent and unreliable cosmos. But it doesn't make sense to see medieval perspective as simply naive, when, as we've seen, these objects are so sophisticated. In fact, they demand that we stop thinking about pictorial space in abstract geometrical terms at all, and instead think about being in space as real, embodied persons. Accepting these bosses on their own terms led me to a way of thinking about pictorial space which is much less to do with geometrical construction and much more to do with phenomenology, using some of Merleau-Ponty's thinking about Cézanne, for example, and the kinds of fractured provisional perspectives which say something different about the experience of being in what Merleau-Ponty calls the flesh of the world, this experience of being embodied and trying to treat our kind of phenomenal experience of what it is to be in the world faithfully. So I wanted to be able to talk about this happening in the bosses with concepts that were a little bit more contemporary. Merleau-Ponty is great to think with, but he's a 20th century philosopher, and as art historians, you get a bit jumpy if you're trying to apply concepts from radically different periods to pre-modern art. So I was looking for things that were a little bit more, a little bit less anachronistic. I ended up thinking about 13th and 14th century theologians and scientists, often the same people in that period, who were extremely interested in the relationship between things as they appear and things as they objectively are. And they debated the correct conditions under which right perception might occur, veridical perception. I ended up looking particularly at Peter of Limoges, who wrote this fascinating treatise called Moralized Optics. This text uses various optical phenomena kind of as parables for demonstrating the difference between our limited subjectivity and the total objective knowledge, which is God's. Peter says, for example, when we see a stick in water, it appears to us to be broken, just as when we look at our own souls, they appear to us to be righteous. But in both cases, there is an objective reality, a straight stick, and a sinful soul, which cannot be seen from our contingent position. Peter employs many fascinating metaphors to discuss this difference between God's sight and ours. He asks us to imagine, for example, the interior of a mirrored sphere, with God's eye at the center of the sphere in total and perfect self-awareness. But as fallen creatures, he says that we peer in from the edge of the mirrored sphere, and we can therefore see only distortions of ourselves. So this thought is playing with ideas of optical distortion and point of view in order to make a point about knowledge. Human seeing is partial and contingent. Other thinkers, such as Nicholas of Hautrecourt and Nicholas of Cusa, are interested in the same questions. Nicholas of Cusa says, he's speaking to God here, he says, "Your eye, God, reaches towards all things without turning. Our eye must turn itself toward an object because of the quantum angle of our vision. But the angle of your vision, O God, is not quantum, but infinite. It is also a circle, or rather an infinite sphere, because your sight is an eye of sphericity and infinite perfection. For your sight sees all things simultaneously, around, above, and below." And since finishing my PhD, I've found I've kept on thinking about these bosses in connection with this issue of perspective and theology. And it's a topic that I hope to maybe develop a bit if I get the chance. I've been reading Julian of Norwich again, for example, for my degree. Julian was anchored in her anchor cell just around the corner in Norwich while these bosses were being cut. And reading her again, I'm struck, for example, just how much her theology is to do with this question of point of view, the perspectival nature of sin and salvation. Our whole condition as creatures, for Julian, is to do with our only seeing things partially. And so our salvation is to be found in accepting and acknowledging this in order to trust in God's complete and loving sight. Her parable of the Lord and the servant, for example, is all about what can and cannot be seen from different states, playing fallen creaturely seeing against divine total seeing. And I've also been reading contemporary theologians like Jean-Luc Marion, whose new work about revelation is concerned with really similar questions of seeing and knowing, and how transcendent things reveal themselves in ordinary things, even whilst remaining distinctive. His concept of anamorphosis is kind of a very medievally shaped thought, really. He uses this analogy, much like Peter used those analogies of distortions in water and with mirrors to talk about revelation. He says that anamorphic images, like Holbein's famous skull, they demand certain positions of the viewer if they're to be read correctly, just as divine revelation chooses the place of its reception and is received on its own terms. In both cases, if we impose our own terms on revelation, we impoverish it and we turn it into an object. So too with our sculptural mode in Norwich. If we try and turn it into something objective and pictorial, we cheapen it and we don't see it as it is. Instead, we need to submit, I think, to its mobile, contingent way of seeing, giving ourselves to that encounter. So I've come to think of this sculptural mode as something which fits nicely alongside a theology of properly creaturely seeing, vision which is never complete, never sufficient, always provisional, always iterative, always embodied. These sculptors ask us to keep on moving, understanding and accepting that our seeing is partial and restless until it rests in God. Now, in August 2019, while I was writing up my thesis, Norwich Cathedral took delivery of a 17-metre helter-skelter and installed it at the west end of the nave for a fortnight as part of their Seeing It Differently initiative. Reverend Canon Andy Bryant explained in the newspaper that the structure would help people to get closer to the magnificent nave bosses, hard to appreciate from ground level. Now, I went to see this and I liked it very much. I have to say that from the slide spiraling towards the nave floor at speed, it was hard to see much of the bosses at all. But it would be hard, I think, to find a better symbol for the embodied, iterative, playful, circling experience encouraged by the sculptural idiom of these bosses than this bold installation. 600 years may have passed since the cloister bosses were carved, but the clergy at Norwich are once again using art and bodily movement within their buildings to prompt discussion, once again equating bodily and spiritual notions of perspective and asking us to see things differently. Now, this has been rather a whistle-stop tour of my thinking about these bosses, but I hope I've been able to show you that they are incredibly sophisticated and subtle pieces of sculpture that demand prolonged, meditative, and circling investigation. And when these kinds of things are possible again, I'd encourage you to go and see them for yourself if you can, not flattened and through a screen, but in real space, enjoying the kind of embodied encounter that they so playfully invite. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob. I feel like we might need a moment just to let that settle. It was absolutely brilliant, and so much there to think about and to take in, I think. You have 2 or 3 people already asking something which you've partially answered, I think, just when you referred to the helter-skelter there, but it seems lots of people are needing to know whether the bosses, particularly in the nave, were carved with the intention of being seen from floor level, or were they actually, you know, I think it's Jonathan who raises, could they, you know, can you see them better from one of the high levels of the clerestory, or can you explain a bit about that?
Yeah, I can try. I think there may even be people here who know more about the nave bosses than I do, as I ended up tunneling such a rabbit hole around the cloister bosses. But you can see them from ground level. This is expensive sculpture to carve, and they tend not to waste money in medieval building projects on things that you can't see. Having said that, you know, it is a strain, and they do rely on the bright polychromy to pick out the different shapes, and they can indeed be better seen from the upper level of the clerestory. As to who would have had access there, and whether there are side altars up there for visiting pilgrims and things, to be honest, I'm not sure off the top of my head. It wasn't something I really thought much about.
I'm going to bring in Peter Doll at this point, who's the Canon librarian at Norwich, who's got his hand up.
Thank you very much, Rob. That was absolutely fascinating, and the most sophisticated justification of the helter-skelter that we're ever likely to hear. So thank you very much for that. Well, I mean, I have lots of questions, but I'll try to confine myself. But I was wondering at the end of your study whether you came to any conclusion about why uniquely in Norwich there should be such a proliferation of historiated bosses, and I mean hugely outnumbering you know, anything anywhere else. And why did they choose this as their particular vehicle for narrative storytelling? And further to that, I was wondering if you could say something about how the bosses within the cloister might have been used, well, in a devotional context or an educational context. Do you have any sense of you know, their particular purpose within that space.
Thank you, Peter. They're both really, really interesting questions. Your first question of why exactly, no, I never got a proper answer really. I have some thoughts. I think it's basically a confluence of the right size of building project occurring at the right time when the right money is available in a region that has the right craftsmen. I think if there were more big cloister building projects spanning the same period, I think we might have seen more of this happening. But no, I mean, it's always hard in art history to explain why a certain workshop really takes off at a certain moment, and why you get these kind of creative masterpieces. I guess I would just want to put this alongside comparable situations, like, for example, you know, a few centuries earlier, the explosion of sculpture on the cathedral at Reims, for example, in France. I mean, you know, we can say how it was funded, we can say where the sculptors came from and things, but why particularly that one went so, you know, produced such a volume of incredible sculpture. You know, it's down to the details, I think, of who was there and how long they were given to work on it. And I don't much subscribe to kind of, you know, great man theory of history, of that it was a particular genius in control, but I think there must be something to do with you know, a team of people paying for the sculpture who were happy to give the craftsmen the amount of time that they needed, and the right craftsmen happened to be available who wanted to do something interesting with it. But no hard and fast answers there. Could you just jog my memory for your second question?
About how the cloister bosses might have been used either devotionally or educationally or any other way.
Yeah. So this is actually something that people have tended to speculate on in the existing literature, and my feeling was that generally this had gone a bit too far. People had tried to come up with quite complex schemes of how certain processional routes, for example, would be copied would be mimicked in the flow of the bosses. So you know, that processions, as semi-liturgical processions through the cloister, would have kind of sequences of boss sculpture that viewers could follow as they went along. My feeling is very much that the complexity of the sculpture, and particularly the fact that it requires this viewing from all around, this kind of gradual inspection. Also the fact that a lot of these bosses, even though there's a vague narrative sequence that goes kind of, you know, 1, 2, 3 down the cloister, often those bosses are flipped the other way, the opposite way around to the. So it's hard to describe without illustration. But whilst the narrative sequence is going 1, 2, 3, 4, each of those bosses wants inspection from this direction. So you kind of have to go 4, 3, 2, 1, and so it kind of complicates the idea that they're designed to be viewed just on a particular route. I was more keen to stress that the cloister is a space in which the monks spent a huge amount of their time, in which they read, in which they prayed, in which they were engaged in contemplative practice, in which they had their hair cut, their tonsures done, in which at this southwest corner, the towels are hung up to dry. It's kind of living space almost. When they're not in choir and they're not in refectory, they're kind of in the cloister. And so that made more sense for me of why there was this incredible richness of sculpture that wanted to be seen from all which ways, was because it's just designed to be lived with.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps we could take a couple of questions together. One person asks about the missing heads. Is that due to vandalism, and is there any desire to see those restored? And we've got a couple of questions about colour. Is it thought to be medieval original colour, or apart from the ones at the hospital Chantry Chapel, which did seem to be newly painted, fairly newly painted. Somebody else refers to the colour. Does it have a role in amplifying the narrative?
Yeah, all good questions. I will try and answer, but again, I'm aware that that Peter and others from the cathedral may know more about this than me. That the colour in the cloister is almost certainly, well, it's not medieval, but it was first refreshed in the 20s by E.W. Tristram, who believed that he could see medieval colour, and so that what he was adding at that point was faithful. How much colour he could see, we don't know. It's not properly recorded, but it's substantially refreshed at that point. There are some heads missing. Generally, though, it's remarkable survival, and is incredibly intact, especially given that it's kind of low-hanging fruit for anybody wishing to make a mess of sculpture. So as to why it escaped, the question really, I think, is why there is so little damage, and I don't think there is a good answer as to why particularly this was left alone when other equivalent sculpture was so much more defaced. If you think of the Lady Chapel at Ely, for example, every head is systematically removed and the glass is all smashed, and really this is one that got away. And I think the colour helping it to be visible is absolutely a factor. Interesting comparison with bosses at Exeter in the nave, where a lot of the polychromy is original and there's technical analysis being done on that. And the kind of standard practice is to wash the whole boss with a red ground and then to pick out the figures against it. And I think in some bosses, cautious because it was refreshed in the 20s and what have you, but in the Herod boss, for example, you can see that similar thing going on at Norwich of a red ground in the background and then the figures picked out in colour on top of that, which is a kind of easy way of making it very visible.
Thank you. An interesting little question here about Julian of Norwich and where her cell was in relation to the cathedral. Might she have seen or even spoken to some of the craftsmen who might have visited her for wisdom? Would she have known what they were doing at that time?
It's fascinating speculation. I mean, nobody. Well, we do know where her cell is. Embarrassingly, I've never actually been. That's on my first list of places to go when we're asked to travel again. I think as to what contact she may or may not have had is pure speculation. Most of her life is actually in the period of when there wasn't much boss cutting going on. It's just in the towards the end of her life that the boss cutting starts up again in the early 15th century. But yeah, it's somebody could do a full Hilary Mantel job on filling in those gaps, I think.
Yeah. What about another quite quick one, I think. Is there any evidence of the works of Peter of Limoges or Nicholas of Cusa in the library at Norwich or other similar works?
It was something that I looked into, because obviously when art historians start making these kind of quite ambitious points, saying, well, perhaps this very philosophical thing influenced this very practical thing, it's great if you can do the slam dunk of showing that it was there in the library. I'm always slightly skeptical as to how much that actually improves your case, because it's still there's this question of whether the people reading the books are anything to do with the people cutting the sculptures. There's a whole can of worms there. They didn't have Peter of Limoges in the library at Norwich, at least not as far as I was able to ascertain. But it was very widely read in Benedictine circles in this period, and it was available at other Benedictine houses locally. It's also a period when Benedictines are investing a lot of money in sending their young initiates off to Oxford to be educated, so they would have been in contact with all sorts of texts that we don't have recorded. I was keen to basically, I looked at other sources as well. Peter's a great example because he puts it so clearly, but I was trying to kind of flesh out a picture of not just one thinker, but a broader concern in a lot of medieval thinking in this period, and preaching particularly. That's the interesting thing about Peter, is that these are examples for preaching, the kind of homiletic concern. So a kind of a general everyday concern with appearance and reality, with subjectivity, with fallen contingent perspective, and what you can and can't know from your fallen position.
Thank you. Perhaps we've got time just for one more quick bit of speculation, perhaps about the windmill, which seems to be getting people going. Sophie says, is it any chance it's Luke 12:16-21, the parable of the bigger barns? And Chris Irvin, is there a connection between the Windmill Boss and the Mystic Mill sculpture at Vézelay?
I love the sculpture at Vézelay. Both fascinating ideas, actually, which I had neither heard in other literature nor thought of myself. The Luke one particularly, I think I need to go and follow up. I think that sounds good. Yeah, no, I don't know. Great.
Well, look, I think we probably ought to leave it there, but we'll save what's been written in the chat and let Rob kind of mull over those. And I'm sure that if Rob has some answers for any of you, that we can put you in touch with each other. Certainly people are asking to see more about the 3D images. Rob, you did mention, I think, that you can look at those. Is that right? Or there's a website where people can.
I will just put a link in the chat, and then people can.
Great. Thank you.
Explore. Yeah, thank you so much for all of your questions. I'm sorry, I've been kind of consumed in trying to answer questions, so I haven't even been able to read the questions in the chat, but they look like a lot of really interesting thoughts, and I will, as Laura says, have a read through them and get in touch. But here is, I want to send that to everyone. Yeah, there is the site where you can have a look at those models at your leisure.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, thank you so much again, and thank you to all of you for joining us this evening and for your questions and comments. It's been a really stimulating evening. As Rob was talking, I realised I'm so sorry, in the sort of kerfuffle over admitting everybody, I didn't even introduce myself. So forgive me, those who don't know me or know the organisation. I'm Laura Moffat, and I'm Director of Art and Christianity. And we're a small organisation, but one that does a lot of work in the field between art and religion more generally. We always are extremely excited to get new members, have new members join us, join our network, carry on the conversation. So, and I've got a handful here of copies of the journal that we produce, which you get if you join as a member. So do please have a look at our website. You may, I think some of you may have come straight through to the Eventbrite site to book your tickets. So if you look up artandchristianity.org, we'll send you a follow-up email tomorrow with all those details, but it would be lovely if you could have a little look there and perhaps support the work that we do. That would be brilliant. But I think all that remains is to say good night to you, and again a huge thank you to Rob for joining us this evening and giving us such a wonderful talk. Thank you.